On a snowy night in a small town, a weary officer crossed paths with a creature no one else saw, and what unfolded inside a simple diner changed not only his life, but the lives of everyone who witnessed it. Sometimes the smallest act of compassion can uncover truths long buried and open hearts that have been closed for years. Stay with this story, and if it touches you, remember to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. An old German Shepherd renamed Rusty stood outside the Pinebrook Diner on a bitter December night, his cracked paw raised against the glass, as if reminding the world that he still existed. Snow had fallen for 5 days straight, blanketing the mountain town in silence, and every home and storefront glowed with light while the streets outside were deserted. The diner was a refuge of warmth, laughter, and the smell of roasted chicken pies and garlic bread. Inside, families leaned close over their meals, teenagers snapped photos of desserts, and couples toasted to the weekend. They were wrapped in comfort, blind to the darkness just beyond the window. Rusty, his ribs visible beneath his dull coat, pressed his paw, again, tap, 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 a faint sound against the glass that no one inside seemed to hear. His ears drooped, one torn from an old fight, his eyes sunken but still carrying the dignity of a life once lived with purpose. He was not just hungry, not just cold, he was forgotten, and his paw against the glass was less a plea for scraps than a question, could anyone see him anymore? At one booth, a little boy noticed. He tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering about the dog outside. She looked up, her face tightening, then pulled him back firmly. "Don't look at strays," she said, returning to her phone, leaving Rusty unseen once more. The boy pressed his lips together, his eyes lingering on the lonely figure outside the window, until his mother turned his face away. Rusty lowered his paw, but didn't leave. He stood motionless as snow melted into rivulets along his back, dripping into the patchy fur around his spine. He inhaled the scents wafting through the doorframe, steamed bread, melted butter, smoked meat, and his body trembled not from fear but exhaustion. He had once known the taste of warm meals from a trusted hand, had once lived with the steady rhythm of duty, but now survival meant scavenging, hoping for scraps, and bracing for rejection. Tonight was no different. A waiter passed the window without looking, balancing a tray piled with plates. A woman in pearls frowned at Rusty's shadow before turning away. A pair of young men laughed as they clinked beer glasses, oblivious to the figure outside. Yet still he stayed, his paw hanging half raised, as though his body remembered the old training, the old signal of alert. It was not begging. It was dignity dressed in silence. For Rusty, leaving meant admitting he was no longer seen at all. He stayed even as the cold pressed tighter. Across the street, under a flickering street lamp, footsteps echoed against the snow. A man walked with steady, heavy strides, his breath clouding in the frozen air. His name was Daniel Hayes, 33 years old, a police officer and a black man in a town where he often carried the weight of being seen as both protector and outsider. His uniform, still dusted with road salt from a long day, clung to him with the fatigue of a shift that began with a car crash and ended with a domestic dispute. His boots were soaked, his gloves stiff, his mind heavy with the silence that followed endless reports and radio chatter. Daniel often walked home after his shift to clear his thoughts, to escape the hum of duty that never really ended. But tonight, as he passed the glowing windows of Pinebrook Diner, something stopped him. At first, it was only a faint sound, tap, 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 so delicate it could have been mistaken for the settling of ice on glass. He turned his head, squinting through the snowfall, and saw the outline. At first, it was just a blur, 4 legs, a drooping head, ears bent under the weight of snow. Then the shape sharpened, revealing a German Shepherd, old and worn, standing perfectly still with his paw raised to the window. Daniel froze in place. His breath caught, not because of the dog's appearance, but because of the posture, the quiet endurance, the silent plea. It was a look he recognized deep inside himself. Years earlier, he had stood in the snow outside his uncle's house after being told there was no room for him, suitcase in hand, while the world turned away. That night, only his childhood dog Max had pressed close to keep him warm. Daniel Hayes stood frozen in the snow outside Pinebrook Diner, his breath clouding in the frigid air as his gaze locked on the old German Shepherd pressing against the glass. Rusty's eyes, dim but unbroken, carried the weight of loneliness that Daniel knew too well, a mirror of nights he had stood outside doors that never opened for him. He shifted his boots against the icy ground, the crunch echoing against the silence, and for a moment he forgot the ache in his body after a 12-hour shift. Daniel was a man molded by hardship, not just by the badge he wore, but by the skin he lived in. Being a black officer in a small northern town meant he was always watched, respected by some, distrusted by others, judged before he spoke. He had grown used to the duality of being protector and outsider, but tonight, staring at the shadow of a starving dog, he felt something deeper stir, the kind of ache that rose from memory and never truly healed. Rusty lowered his paw, stepping back slightly as if bracing for another dismissal, but Daniel did not look away. His father's face flashed in his mind. Marcus Hayes, a sheriff killed in the line of duty when Daniel was only 11. That loss had taught him early that survival meant control over his tone, his emotions, his very breath. He carried that lesson into every call, every arrest, every quiet walk home. Yet, the sight of this dog unraveled his discipline. He remembered another winter long ago when he was sent away after his father's funeral. Standing in threadbare clothes on his uncle's porch, he had been told to go back to a father who would never return. That night, only his dog Max had refused to leave his side, pressing against him in silence, giving him the one thing no person had offered: unconditional presence. Rusty's posture outside the diner was identical to Max's that night. Quiet, resigned, but still waiting. Daniel took a step closer. Snowflakes clung to his wool cap and melted into the salt-stained fabric of his uniform. His hand brushed the badge clipped to his belt, a symbol of authority that felt small compared to the thread pulling him toward the dog. Inside the diner, laughter rose above the hum of music, a contrast that made the silence outside sharper, almost cruel. Daniel's shadow stretched across the snow toward Rusty, who flinched but did not flee. His eyes lifted once more, meeting Daniel's with a kind of weary recognition, as though he had known this man long before their paths ever crossed. A faint twitch of Rusty's tail broke the stillness, not a wag, more like a memory of one. Daniel crouched slowly, his knees soaking in the icy slush, and simply held his ground, not reaching, not calling, just offering space. He whispered softly, "I see you, old boy," words barely carried by the wind. For the first time that night, Rusty's breathing slowed, his body no longer rigid with expectation of rejection. But before Daniel could step closer, the back door of the diner creaked open with a rush of warm air. A young waiter, Ethan, stepped out, his arms burdened with a tray of greasy dishes scraped clean. He muttered under his breath when his eyes landed on Rusty. "Not you again." With one harsh motion, Ethan dumped the contents into the dumpster scraps, scattering across the frozen ground. The clang of ceramic plates echoed through the alley. Rusty instinctively stepped back, ears flattening, but his eyes stayed on the food, hunger clawing at his ribs. Ethan scowled, waving a rag at him. "Go on, get out of here." Rusty lowered himself further, tail-tucked body curved inward, not from aggression, but submission. He took 2 steps back, not daring to approach his dignity bruised yet again. Daniel's jaw clenched. He recognized that posture. He had seen it in broken men at traffic stops, in children hiding behind bruises, and in his own reflection when he was told he didn't belong. The memory of his uncle's door slamming shut echoed in his chest like a wound reopening. Ethan, satisfied that the dog had retreated, turned to head back inside, but stopped when he noticed Daniel standing there. His forced smile wavered. "Evening, officer. Everything all right?" Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on Rusty, his voice calm but weighted, cut through the night. "Was that necessary?" Ethan blinked. "Excuse me?" Daniel stood slowly, his tall frame casting a shadow across the snow. "The yelling. The way you threw that food. That dog isn't hurting anyone." Ethan shifted, glancing nervously at the security camera above the back door. "It's not personal. He's been hanging around all week. Management says if we let one in, we'll have a dozen strays at the door." Daniel's voice dropped lower, quiet but firm. "That's not a stray. That's a working dog, or was." Ethan frowned, clearly uncomfortable, muttered something under his breath, and disappeared back into the glow of the diner, letting the door swing shut with a heavy thud. Daniel turned back toward Rusty, who now stood motionless in the snow, his eyes still fixed on him. His name tag read Frank, and his voice carried the sharp impatience of someone used to being obeyed rather than questioned. "Damn mud again," he barked his words, punching through the night air as he spotted Rusty lingering near the dumpster. In his hand, he gripped a long wooden stirring spoon, and with one aggressive swing, he slammed it against the side of the metal bin. The sound rang out like a gunshot echoing through the narrow alley, startling Rusty into a panicked slip. His legs buckled on the icy concrete, and he collapsed awkwardly on his hip before scrambling upright with a labored whine that scratched Daniel's heart raw. Daniel took an instinctive step forward, fists curling in his gloves, every nerve in him screaming to intervene, but he held his position, his chest tight, watching as Rusty lowered his ears and tucked his tail as though this kind of treatment had become an expected ritual. The old dog didn't growl, didn't fight, didn't run. He simply stood in a crooked, submissive hunch, as if apologizing for wanting the scraps of food clinging to the frozen ground. Frank sneered, taking a step closer, his breath rising in furious clouds. "I see you digging again, and I'll call animal control myself. We don't need diseased strays scaring off paying customers." His tone was dripping with contempt, and each word was like a lash against Rusty's dignity. Daniel's jaw tightened, and suddenly the snowy night folded back into a memory from 17 years earlier. He saw himself at 10 years old, balancing on the frozen creek near his uncle's farm. The sound of cracking ice beneath his boots, the sudden plunge into a world of blue water and terror. He remembered his limbs flailing his throat, burning the cold, pulling him down until a flash of fur and strength burst into the water. Max, his childhood dog, had leapt in without hesitation, dragging him to safety. Max's body had shivered violently afterward, and 2 days later, he had died from hypothermia. Daniel had stood by the oak tree where Max was buried, fists pressed against his sides, swearing he would never forget the sacrifice of a creature who gave everything for him. And now, decades later, that same posture of courage, beaten into submission, stood before him in Rusty, an echo of Max's loyalty, twisted into despair by years of abandonment. The sound of Frank's spoon striking metal again snapped Daniel out of his memory. He stepped into the alley, his boots crunching hard against the ice. Frank jerked his head up, clearly startled by the sight of an officer, and tried to force a casual smile. "Evening, officer, didn't see you there. Just giving this mutt a scare before he digs through the trash again." Daniel kept walking until he was only a few feet away. His frame steady, his voice calm, but edged with steel. "You always use kitchen utensils as weapons." "Frank," the man froze his bravado, faltering for a split second. "I wasn't going to hit him, just letting him know he's not welcome." Daniel's eyes, dark and unwavering, shifted to Rusty, who had taken another step back but still hadn't fled. "He's not hurting anyone." Daniel said each word deliberate. "That's not a mutt. That's a working dog, or was." Rusty blinked slowly, the faintest shift in his tail, betraying that he heard the defense spoken on his behalf. Frank muttered something under his breath and turned away, clearly uncomfortable under Daniel's scrutiny. "Suit yourself, officer, but don't let him hang around. We've got health codes to worry about." He pushed back through the door, leaving the alley in silence, once more the slam of the frame echoing in his wake. Daniel crouched slowly, his knees creaking against the frozen ground, and held Rusty's gaze. The dog's scars were clearer now. In the glow of the street lamp, a healed nick in his ear patches of fur rubbed raw ribs sharp beneath his skin. But beneath it all, Daniel saw eyes that weren't wild or broken. They were waiting. Waiting for recognition. Waiting for someone to stand between him and the cruelty of the world. Daniel extended no hand, made no sudden movement, only spoke softly. "You've seen too much, haven't you?" Old boy Rusty trembled, but did not retreat, the thread between them tightening into something fragile, yet undeniable. Snowflakes drifted lazily between them, covering the marks of Rusty's slip on the ice, as though erasing the humiliation. Inside the diner, the hum of laughter and clinking glasses continued, oblivious to the silent battle taking place just outside its walls. For Rusty, the rejection was nothing new. He had faced it countless nights, each one carving away at the dignity he once carried proudly in service. For Daniel, it was a reminder of every moment he had been told he didn't belong. Every door closed, every face turned away. And in that recognition, an oath formed silently in Daniel's chest. Daniel stayed crouched in the snow long after Frank slammed the diner's back door shut, his breath rising in pale clouds that mingled with the steam of Rusty's shallow exhales. The night around them had grown quieter, the snowfall heavier, as if the world itself was waiting to see what would happen between the officer and the broken dog. Rusty's paw still hovered slightly forward, a gesture torn between instinct and hesitation, and Daniel felt something old stir deep in his chest, something he had buried beneath years of duty and survival. The scars on Rusty's face, the tremor in his legs, the patience in his eyes, they were not the marks of a stray. They were the echoes of a soldier who had once known discipline training and loyalty now stripped of all but memory. Daniel whispered again, his voice low but firm, "You're not just a stray, I know what you are." His words carried more than recognition. They carried the weight of his own history, the boy he had once been, the man he had become, and the battles still carved into his bones. Rusty's ears twitched, the torn edge of one ear catching the light of the street lamp, as if responding not to the words, but to the truth beneath them. The dog did not step forward, but he did not retreat either, and for Daniel, that small act of defiance against fear felt like the beginning of trust. But trust was fragile, and the night was not finished testing it. The diner door creaked open again, and this time Frank returned, carrying not just the wooden spoon, but a bucket of water he had filled to freeze the trash pile into a block that scavengers could not touch. His muttered curses grew louder as he caught sight of Rusty still standing near the bin, Daniel's tall frame crouched beside him. Frank froze, his mouth twisting into a sneer. "Still here, huh? I told you to keep that thing away from our place." Daniel rose slowly, his boots scraping the ice, his shoulders broad beneath the patrol coat, his voice calm but threaded with warning. "He's not bothering anyone," Frank scoffed, gripping the bucket tighter. "Not bothering anyone until health inspectors shut us down. You want this mutt, take him. He's not our problem." He stepped forward as if to pour the water, but Daniel's eyes narrowed and his hand dropped instinctively to rest near his belt where his badge gleamed. "Set that bucket down." The command was not loud, but it carried the authority of a man who would not yield. Frank hesitated, then muttered under his breath and turned back inside, slamming the door with a final burst of defiance. The alley fell silent again, save for the faint rustle of snow landing on the dumpster lid. Daniel looked back at Rusty, who had flinched but remained where he was, his chest rising with shallow breaths, his tail pressed low. Daniel crouched again, whispering, "I know what it's like to be pushed out into the cold." His mind slipped backward, carried by the force of the memory he could never fully escape. He was 11 again, standing on his uncle's porch after his father's funeral, suitcase and hand jacket too thin for the Ohio winter. His uncle's voice had been sharp and final, "Go back to your dad." But his dad was gone, shot in the line of duty, leaving Daniel in a world that suddenly had no room for him. The door had slammed, and the boy had been left outside in the snow, shaking from more than cold. Only Max had been there, pressing against his leg, wrapping him in silent loyalty. That night, Daniel had learned the truth of abandonment, the taste of rejection, the lesson that sometimes even family could turn away. And looking at Rusty now, beaten down by hunger and years of silence, Daniel saw the same lesson etched into the old dog's body, a creature who had given everything to a world that no longer remembered him. Rusty lowered his head slightly, as if sensing the storm inside. The man crouched before him. His eyes blinked slowly, not in fear, but in recognition, a silent acknowledgement that pain was a language both of them spoke. Daniel exhaled his breath, trembling in the cold, and reached the edge of a decision. He could walk away, leave the dog to another night of snow and hunger, tell himself it was not his problem, or he could step fully into this fragile bond and refuse to let history repeat itself. The choice was clear long before he asked the question. He rose to his full height, snowflakes settling into his dark hair, and spoke with quiet conviction. "Not this time. Not tonight." He glanced at the diner windows glowing with warmth, then back at Rusty, who trembled but still held his ground. "You're coming with me." Rusty's ears flicked, his body stiff with uncertainty, but his paws did not move away. For the first time, there was no retreat in him, only the cautious stillness of a soldier waiting for orders. Daniel extended his hand slowly, not to grab, but to offer. Rusty sniffed the air, nostrils flaring, then leaned forward just enough to let his nose brush the edge of Daniel's glove. The touch was fleeting, but it was enough to shatter the barrier between them. Daniel felt it like a spark, not of electricity, but of memory, the same connection he had felt when Max had pressed his paw against his knee before dying. The wind howled down the narrow street, tugging at Daniel's patrol coat, scattering snow across Rusty's back. Yet, in that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's voice, lowered almost a whisper, carried only to the dog's ears. "You're safe now, old boy. I'm not here to chase you off." Rusty blinked slowly, his body stiff with hesitation, but he did not pull away. His tail, tucked firmly beneath his belly, twitched once, a flicker of life beneath the exhaustion. For Daniel, that small movement was enough. He crouched again, his gloved hands open, making himself smaller, less threatening. Years of police training had taught him to control confrontations, to command presence, but tonight, he let all of that fall away. This wasn't about dominance. This was about respect. Rusty inched forward, one paw sliding across the ice, leaving a faint print before his weight settled onto it. His ribs shifted with the motion, the sharp edges visible even through the thick but matted fur, and Daniel's chest tightened at the sight. No creature should have been reduced to this, not a dog who had once carried duty in every stride. Another step, then another, until Rusty was close enough that Daniel could see the scars carved into his muzzle and the frost clinging to the torn edge of his ear. The dog lowered his head, waiting for rejection, bracing for a blow, but Daniel did not move. Instead, he exhaled slowly, letting the steam of his breath curl around them like a fragile shield against the cold. "You're not alone anymore," he repeated, steady and sure. Rusty's nose brushed against his glove, a fleeting touch, then lingered longer this time, as if testing whether kindness could still exist in a world that had taught him otherwise. Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he fought the instinct to reach too soon. He held still, allowing Rusty to choose. When the dog finally pressed the weight of his head against Daniel's palm, the contact sent a rush of warmth through him that had nothing to do with the patrol coat or the snow. It was trust fragile and hard-won, and it was being offered to him now. Daniel whispered, "That's it, partner, that's it." The word slipped out unplanned, partner, the title his father had once used for Max when he spoke of the dog as family, not pet. Daniel swallowed hard against the memory and blinked back the sting in his eyes. Rusty leaned into the touch a moment longer before lowering himself carefully to sit on the icy ground beside Daniel, his chest rising and falling in slow, uneven rhythm. The sound of a muffled cheer came from inside the diner as someone toasted over wine, but outside in the snow, the silence was sacred, a quiet that belonged only to them. Daniel stayed crouched, his hand resting lightly against Rusty's head, feeling the faint vibration of the dog's breath through his glove. He thought of all the times he had walked home from a shift, with nothing but the echo of his boots for company, how he had accepted solitude as the cost of survival. Yet now, with an old dog leaning against his knee, he felt something he had not allowed himself in years: connection. Rusty shifted, pressing closer, as though testing how much weight Daniel could hold, and Daniel accepted it without flinching. He knew this bond was not forged in one night, that years of abandonment would not vanish with a single touch, but it was a beginning, and beginnings mattered. Snow continued to fall, settling into Rusty's fur, dusting Daniel's hat, cloaking the alley in stillness. For a long time, neither moved. The dog's trembling eased, the rigid posture softened, and Daniel's shoulders lowered from the tension he had carried all evening. They sat like that until the cold gnawed at Daniel's knees, and the night threatened to consume the fragile moment. He finally rose slowly, his hand sliding away, but not in rejection, only in invitation. Rusty looked up, his eyes reflecting the faint glow of the street lamp, and for the first time, there was no flinch, no retreat. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the half sandwich he had saved from earlier, forgotten during the chaos of his shift. He tore it carefully, tossing half onto the snow, a few feet away, not forcing Rusty to take it from his hand. The dog sniffed to the air, ears twitching, then stepped forward cautiously, lowering his head to the food. He ate slowly, almost reverently, as if reminding himself what it meant to be fed. Daniel's chest ached at the sight, not from pity, but from the recognition of resilience. This dog had survived hunger, cold, rejection, and yet still chose to trust, still chose to take a step toward him. When Rusty finished, he looked back up, his eyes meeting Daniel's again with something quieter than desperation. It was gratitude, cautious but undeniable. Daniel nodded. "Good boy." Daniel's boots crunched against the snow as he approached the front entrance of the Pinebrook Diner, the neon sign humming faintly above the door while Rusty limped beside him, his head low, but his body no longer retreating. The street was mostly empty, blanketed in silence, except for the steady beat of their steps, but Daniel could feel the weight of eyes from inside the glowing windows. Families leaned close over steaming plates, couples toasted with wine, and children laughed, unaware that a tired old dog was about to change the rhythm of their night. Daniel pulled open the heavy wooden door, the warmth of the diner spilling over him in a wave that smelled of baked bread and roasted meat. He stepped inside, snow melting from his coat onto the polished hardwood, and the sound of conversation faltered. Rusty followed his paws, clicking softly on the floor. His limp pronounced but steady, and silence rippled through the diner like a sudden draft. Forks froze, mid-air glasses hovered halfway to lips, and the low jazz playing in the background seemed to fade into nothing. The hostess at the front stand, a young woman with auburn hair pulled into a messy bun, blinked in shock. "Sir," she began, her voice tentative, "we can't have animals in here unless." Daniel held up his badge with one hand while keeping the other near Rusty's back. "He's with me," he said calmly, "and he's not just any dog." Something in his tone, soft but resolute, silenced her objection, and after a brief hesitation, she nodded and gestured toward an empty table near the fireplace. Daniel led Rusty through the room, aware of every set of eyes following them. Some faces were disapproving, others curious, and a few softened with sympathy. He pulled out a chair at the corner table, patting the space beside it. "Sit, partner." Rusty hesitated, scanning the room with weary eyes, but lowered himself carefully onto the floor, curling his tail around his legs as though trying to take up as little space as possible. The glow of the fireplace flickered across his scarred face, highlighting both the years of service and the months of abandonment. Daniel settled into his chair, removing his cap and brushing snow from his shoulders, his presence calm but protective. A waitress in her 30s with long brown hair braided over one shoulder approached quietly. Her name tag read Lena, and there was a tired grace in her movements, the kind of weariness that comes from double shifts and raising children alone. She didn't flinch at the sight of Rusty. Instead, her eyes softened, and she asked simply, "Do you want a bowl of water for him?" Daniel looked up, surprised by the offer, and nodded. "And if the kitchen has any plain cooked meat, no seasoning he hasn't eaten in days." Lena gave a small smile. "I'll see what we can do." When she returned moments later with a stainless steel bowl of water and a plate of plain steamed chicken, she set it gently on the floor in front of Rusty. The dog sniffed it cautiously, then looked to Daniel as though asking permission. Daniel gave a subtle nod. Rusty lowered his head and began to eat slowly at first, then, with more certainty, each bite measured but desperate, his body trembling with the effort. The room grew quieter as he ate, conversations resuming, but at a lower volume, as if the sight of a scarred old dog finding a meal deserved reverence. At a nearby booth, an 8-year-old girl with blonde curls stood on her knees to get a better look. "Mom," she whispered, tugging at her mother's sleeve, "why is the police officer feeding that broken dog?" Her mother, a woman in her 40s dressed neatly with a phone glued to her hand, looked up for the first time all night. She met Daniel's eyes briefly, then looked at the dog. Her expression softened, but she said nothing. The little girl slipped down from her booth and padded over to the fireplace, where Daniel and Rusty sat. Daniel noticed her approach but didn't stop her. Rusty lifted his head, alert but calm, his eyes following the small figure. The girl knelt slowly, her hand trembling slightly as she extended it. "Can I pet him?" she asked. Daniel looked at Rusty, who didn't flinch. He gave the girl a nod. "If he lets you." She reached out, palm open, and Rusty sniffed her fingers before lowering his head into her hand. His eyes closed briefly as she stroked the top of his head, and for the first time in years, his posture loosened. "He's soft," she said with a smile, then looked up at Daniel. "Why did you bring him in here?" Daniel rested his arm on the table. "Because he deserves to be warm and full just like anyone else." The girl tilted her head, considering that, then said, "Even if he's old." The dog wasn't trembling anymore, but Daniel noticed the weight of scars that marked his face, the torn ear, the stiffness in his back legs. Those were not the marks of an ordinary stray. He had seen enough working dogs in his years on patrol to recognize the way they carried themselves, the posture of silent vigilance, even when broken. As Rusty shifted, Daniel's fingers brushed against something hard beneath the matted fur of his neck. He frowned, parting the thick strands until his glove met a small metallic bump, hidden beneath the worn leather of the collar. His chest tightened as recognition surged. "What's this?" he murmured. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small RFID scanner that officers in Pine Brook carried for checking pets or stolen animals. He had almost forgotten it was there. Rusty lifted his head slightly, his weary eyes watching Daniel, but not resisting, as the device was pressed gently near his neck. A soft beep broke through the hum of the diner. The screen lit up, ID 9C 4882 CHQ. Registered name Shadow. K-9 Unit Colorado State Police retired missing. Handler Sergeant Miguel Torres, deceased. Status decommissioned. Last active log February 13th, 2023. Condition presumed dead. Daniel's breath stalled as he read the words. The scarred, trembling dog lying at his boots was not just a survivor, he was a hero, thought to have perished 2 years ago in a meth lab explosion outside Fort Carson, the same blast that had killed his handler. Daniel remembered the story. He had read about it in the paper, a tragic footnote of a dangerous raid gone wrong, the kind that left both the department and community mourning. The handler had been buried with honors, the dog presumed dead in the rubble. Yet here he was, scarred, starved, but alive. Daniel lowered the scanner slowly, his hand trembling as he brushed Rusty's collar again. "You're not just Rusty," he whispered, his voice breaking with awe. "You're Shadow." The dog's ears flicked, as if he recognized the name, his tired eyes meeting Daniel's with a flicker of something older than recognition, something like memory. Daniel felt the weight of the revelation settle heavily on his chest. This wasn't just about saving a stray from the cold anymore. This was about dignity, about a life of service, abandoned and forgotten. The dog at his feet had once carried a badge, had once saved lives, had once been trusted as a partner in the line of fire, and now he had been left to starve outside a diner window. Daniel clenched his jaw, anger rising at the thought, but he forced it back, focusing on the dog, whose head now lowered once again onto his boots. Across the room, Lena the waitress returned with a basket of bread rolls fresh from the oven. She set it on the table, her eyes flicking to Shadow with quiet curiosity. "Is he okay?" she asked softly. Daniel's voice was low but firm. "He's more than okay. He's a hero." Lena blinked, unsure whether he spoke metaphorically, but before she could ask more, another voice cut through the hum of the diner. "Excuse me," officer said, a man in a charcoal vest and pressed slacks, his name tag reading Mr. Caldwell. He was the diner's manager, his gray hair combed neatly, his expression sharp with the authority of someone who valued order above compassion. "I understand the situation is unusual, but animals are not permitted in the dining area. Health code. Some patrons have expressed concern." Daniel looked up slowly, his eyes unflinching. "He's not a stray," he said, his voice steady. "He's a retired K-9 officer. He was presumed dead in the line of duty." Caldwell's lips pressed into a thin line. "That may be, but rules are rules. If we allow this once, what precedent does it set?" The air in the diner grew taut. Diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding Daniel's gaze. The silence felt heavy, pressing against Daniel like the cold outside. He rose from his chair, his frame tall and resolute, his hand brushing the badge at his belt. "If you're asking me to choose between staying and throwing him back into the snow, I'll make it easy. We're leaving." His words carried not anger, but conviction, the kind of steady authority that filled the room more powerfully than shouting ever could. Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching, his body tense, as though he could sense the rising conflict. Daniel bent slightly, his voice softer now. "Come on, partner." He reached for his coat, preparing to leave, but before he could take a step, a voice from a nearby table broke the silence. "Dinner's on me," said an older man in a worn trench coat, a military pin gleaming on his lapel. He laid a folded bill on the table with trembling hands, then reached down to pat Shadow's shoulder once. "For him," he added simply, before shuffling back to his seat. Daniel blinked in surprise. Before he could respond, another voice rose, a woman in her 50s with cropped silver hair. She stepped forward, placing a crisp $20 bill beside the first. "Make that 2 dinners, and maybe a blanket." Then another hand extended across the aisle, then another. A younger man in a leather jacket added a 10. "For the dog who outran an explosion," he said. Even Lena reached into her apron, pulling out a 5 and placing it gently on the pile. "He saved someone else's life once," she said softly. "Maybe it's time we return the favor." Caldwell stood stiffly, his jaw tightening as he watched the quiet rebellion unfold before him. The pile of bills grew, not a payment, but a declaration. A united stand for a forgotten hero. The diner hummed with a new kind of silence, one layered not with absence of sound, but with the weight of collective realization that the dog curled at Officer Daniel Hayes' boots was not just an old stray, but a forgotten hero. The pile of bills left by strangers sat on the edge of the table like a quiet act of defiance. Their meaning greater than money, they were declarations that the community would not allow this animal to be dismissed again. Shadow, once presumed dead, now rested his head on Daniel's boots, his scarred muzzle softened by the glow of the fireplace. He did not understand the murmurs around him, the significance of what had just been uncovered, but his breathing was steadier, his body looser, his ribs rising and falling in the rhythm of a creature who had, at least for tonight, found belonging. Daniel kept his hand lightly against Shadow's back, his gaze steady as the manager Caldwell adjusted his vest, his lips pressed into a line that tried to mask his frustration. Caldwell's eyes swept the room calculating, but he could not deny the sight of his patrons siding against him. His authority had been quietly undercut by the collective will of people who had chosen compassion over policy. He gave one last stiff nod before retreating to the kitchen, his step sharp against the polished floor. A low murmur swept through the diner once he was gone, the tension easing into conversations that carried more weight than before. People leaned toward each other, speaking softly about what they had just witnessed. Words like hero explosion and forgotten drifted through the air, and Daniel knew that Shadow's story was no longer just his secret. It was out in the open, fragile but alive, a seed that would grow into something neither of them could yet predict. Lena returned to the table, her notepad tucked under her arm, her expression different, now less tired, more resolute. She crouched briefly, scratching lightly behind Shadow's ear, her voice soft enough that only Daniel heard. "I don't know how he survived out there, but I'm glad you brought him in." Daniel nodded, his throat tight, and whispered back, "He shouldn't have had to survive alone." Shadow stirred at the gentle scratch, leaning slightly into the touch before lowering his head again with a sigh that sounded almost human in its exhaustion. The little girl with blonde curls, Emily, watched from her booth, her chin resting on her folded arms, her eyes fixed on the dog as if she were watching something sacred. Her mother, Rachel, glanced at Daniel and then at Shadow, and though she said nothing, her phone remained face down on the table for the first time that evening. Daniel took in these small details, each one proof that Shadow's presence was changing the room, softening edges, forcing people to confront something raw and real. Yet, not everyone was softened. A man in a tailored coat at a nearby table leaned toward his companion, his voice sharp though not loud. "It's a health violation. This isn't a shelter. It's a restaurant." His companion shifted uncomfortably, but nodded in half agreement. The words carried far enough that Daniel heard them. His hand tensed slightly on Shadow's back, but he did not rise to confront. Instead, before he could speak, Harold, the older veteran who had first laid money on the table, leaned across from his booth and fixed the man with a steady glare. His voice was rough, but unwavering. "That dog has done more for this country than you ever will, sitting there complaining about your filet mignon." The man in the tailored coat flushed his mouth, snapping shut, as several heads turned toward him, and he suddenly found great interest in the untouched wine glass in front of him. A quiet ripple of approval moved through the room, subtle nods and murmurs of agreement, and Daniel felt the bond between the diners strengthen their collective defense of Shadow, solidifying into something unshakable. Shadow himself seemed unaware of the debate, his eyelids heavy, his body curling tighter against the fireplace's warmth. Daniel studied him, imagining the miles he must have traveled. The winters endured, the hunger suffered after that explosion 2 years ago. How many nights had he stood outside windows like this, ignored, shooed away, reduced from partner to pariah? The thought made Daniel's chest ache, and he reached down again, murmuring, "You deserved better than this." A new voice broke the fragile calm. Officer Lena said, returning with a small blanket from the back, "Maybe he should have this. It's clean. I'll say it was a lost coat if Caldwell asks." Daniel accepted it with a nod of gratitude, draping it gently over Shadow's body. The dog shifted slightly, exhaled a deep sigh, and allowed his weight to lean fully into Daniel's boots, a surrender not of defeat, but of trust. A few tables away, Emily tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, can I bring him a cookie?" Rachel hesitated, her expression torn between the instinct to maintain boundaries and the pull of her daughter's innocence. Finally, she nodded. Emily approached shyly, holding a small oatmeal cookie in both hands. She knelt beside Shadow, offering it carefully. "For you," she whispered. Shadow sniffed, but did not take it. Instead, he lifted his gaze to Daniel, waiting for his approval. Daniel smiled faintly and nodded once. Only then did Shadow take the cookie gently from Emily's hand, his teeth barely grazing her fingers. Emily's giggle lit the air, and the entire diner seemed to exhale, as if something sacred had just unfolded in front of them. Rachel's eyes glistened as she watched her daughter return, and she reached for her hand under the table, squeezing it tightly. The moment was not lost on Daniel. He had seen hardened hearts shift before, but rarely with this kind of quiet power. Shadow, without speaking a word, was healing something in this room, pulling threads of empathy where there had only been indifference. The community had rallied to defend Shadow Caldwell, had relented, and the old dog had found warmth for the night. But the scars carved into his body and his soul whispered of trials still unresolved. And then, as if fate itself was determined to remind everyone that healing could be as sudden as it was fragile, the door to the diner opened, and a man in a dark parka entered, snow clinging to his beard and eyebrows, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. Daniel's eyes lifted in recognition and softened at the sight of Eli Carter, an old friend from the academy who had chosen a different path, not in law enforcement, but in veterinary medicine. Eli, calm and composed with his wry humor and gentle hands, had become the town's most trusted veterinarian, and Daniel had texted him quietly after discovering Shadow's identity. Now, Eli was here, his presence unassuming, but carrying weight as he scanned the room and spotted Daniel at the corner table. "So, he's the one," Eli said as he approached, his voice pitched low, so as not to disturb the murmurs of the diners who had already turned to watch. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, found him outside. Thought he was just another stray. Turns out he's Shadow." Eli crouched down beside the dog, his hands moving with practiced care as he examined the scarred muzzle, the stiff legs, the frostbitten paws. "Hey there, soldier." Eli murmured, his tone half greeting, half prayer. Shadow's ears twitched, his eyes lifting to meet the vet's gaze, and though he did not move away, his body remained taut until Eli's touch proved gentle, firm, respectful. "Permission granted." Eli whispered with a faint smile, running his hands along the spine, pressing lightly at the joints, checking the pads of the paws. Old scarred, but lungs or clear eyes, still sharp teeth worn, but serviceable. He just needs warmth food and someone who won't give up on him. Daniel exhaled a breath he had not realized he had been holding. "I can give him that," he said firmly, his hand brushing Shadow's neck with renewed conviction. Across the diner, a young boy with sandy hair had been watching intently, his fingers twisting the hem of his hoodie, his eyes wide but cautious. His mother, Melissa, sat beside him, her face etched with quiet exhaustion, the kind of weariness that comes from battles invisible to others. She had been raising her son alone since her husband left, and in the last year, she had faced a battle even harder than loneliness. Her son Ben had been diagnosed with selective mutism and autism spectrum disorder. He had not spoken a word in public for months, retreating into silence so profound it made Melissa's heart ache daily. Tonight she had only brought him to the diner in the hope of a small distraction from their routines, never imagining what they were about to witness. Ben slid from the booth without a word, his mother gasping softly but not stopping him. He walked slowly each step, hesitant until he reached the corner where Daniel and Eli crouched beside Shadow. The old dog lifted his head, ears twitching, but he did not move, his body still and open, as though he sensed the fragility of the boy approaching him. Ben's hand trembled as he extended it, fingers hovering just above Shadow's blanket. For a moment it seemed he would pull back, retreat into the silence that had become his shield. But then Shadow shifted, nudging his nose forward until it brushed against the boy's hand. The contact was light, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of a miracle. Ben froze, then slowly, carefully placed his hand on Shadow's fur. The dog's tail thumped once against the hardwood, a sound so ordinary, yet so extraordinary that the diners nearby gasped softly. Melissa's eyes filled with tears as she watched her son, who had not reached out to anyone outside their home for nearly a year, stroke the fur of a dog who had once been written off as lost. Daniel felt his throat tighten, his hand pressing harder against Shadow's back, anchoring himself in the moment. Eli leaned back slightly, his eyes glinting with recognition of something far greater than medicine unfolding before them. "Well," he whispered, "I'd say he's already earning his keep." Ben's lips curved, a small tentative smile breaking through the walls of silence, and though no words escaped, his mother saw enough to cover her mouth in shock. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his shoulders, her tears slipping freely. "Thank you," she whispered, to no one in particular, to Daniel, to Shadow, to the universe that had allowed this moment. The diner grew hushed again, every pair of eyes fixed on the quiet miracle in the corner. Conversations stalled, forks paused, and for a heartbeat, the entire room seemed to breathe together, united not by rules or policies, but by the fragile thread of hope that had entered their midst. Shadow leaned further into Ben's touch, his scarred body no longer trembling, but steady, accepting the boy's hand, with the kind of dignity only a survivor could offer. Daniel looked around the diner, at the softened faces, at the eyes blinking away tears, at the posture of people leaning forward, as though afraid to miss what might happen next. He realized that Shadow was not only healing himself tonight, not only forging a bond with a weary officer or a silent boy, but also stitching together a room full of strangers into something like community. The diner slowly emptied as the night stretched on the storm outside, blanketing Pinebrook in layers of white that muffled even the sound of plows rumbling down the distant main road. Inside, though, the air was still warm with the echo of what had just happened. A silent boy touching a forgotten dog. A room of strangers pulled together by a moment of grace. Shadow lay at Daniel Hayes' boots, his belly finally full, his scarred body draped in a blanket, but his eyes no longer hollow. They carried a steadiness that mirrored Daniel's own, as if the dog knew this was not the end of his story, but a turning point. Daniel kept his hand on Shadow's back, his mind replaying the revelation of the microchip, the diner's defiance, Eli's quiet diagnosis, and Ben's small trembling hand pressing into fur that had known too much cold. He thought of Max, the dog who had saved him as a boy, and of his father, Marcus the sheriff, who had died in the line of duty, and he realized that life had brought him here for a reason. This wasn't just about compassion. It was about justice, about restoring dignity to a soul that had given everything and been cast aside. When the last of the diners drifted out into the snow and Lena dimmed the overhead lights, Daniel rose and clipped a leash gently to Shadow's collar. "Come on, partner," he whispered. The old dog stirred stiff but willing and rose to his feet, limping beside Daniel as they stepped back into the freezing night. Snowflakes clung to Daniel's coat, dusted Rusty's no Shadow's fur, but this time the cold did not feel like an enemy. It felt like a cleansing silence, like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. The following weeks were a blur of change. Daniel officially adopted Shadow, signing the paperwork that would give the dog a home. But in truth, the bond had been sealed that night beneath the diner's fireplace. Shadow rode in the back of Daniel's cruiser, sometimes poking his head between the seats, his tongue lolling like a dog, much younger than his years. Other times, sitting watchful and still, his eyes scanning streets with the instinct of a professional who had never stopped being on duty. The townsfolk noticed, and the story spread. First in whispers, then in the local paper, then across nearby counties. The K9 thought dead in an explosion had been found alive, scarred but unbroken, taken in by a black officer who had recognized him not as a mutt, but as a hero. Donations arrived at the station. Toys, blankets, food, small handwritten notes from children thanking Shadow for his service. Melissa and her son Ben visited often, the boy always silent but always smiling when Shadow nudged his hand, his mother always teary but grateful, repeating how the dog had given her hope where doctors had offered none. Eli checked on him weekly, monitoring his health, shaking his head in disbelief at the resilience of an animal who had wandered hundreds of miles and survived 2 winters on his own. And then one morning, Shadow changed everything again. Daniel had just ended a routine patrol when Shadow grew restless in the cruiser, pacing ears, twitching nose pressed against the window. His bark came low and deliberate, not frantic, but focused. Daniel trusted him instantly. He pulled the car over near an abandoned construction site, clipped the leash, and followed, as Shadow pulled forward with a determination Daniel had never seen in him. Through weeds and broken boards, the dog led him into the skeleton of a house left unfinished. There, beneath collapsed planks, Shadow stopped and growled low. Daniel crouched, pushing aside debris, and uncovered a duffel bag filled with gloves, bolt cutters, a crowbar, and a wallet embossed with the Pinebrook Police Department seal. It belonged to Officer Greg Hansen, who had been missing for 6 weeks. Daniel's breath caught. He called it in immediately, and soon the site was swarming with investigators. Shadow sat calmly beside him, his tail thumping once every few minutes, as though he knew he had just brought the truth back into the light. Fingerprints from the tools led to a drifter named Lyle Hargrove, already suspected of arson. Forensics tied him not only to Hansen's disappearance, but also to the explosion that had killed Sergeant Miguel Torres, Shadow's former handler. The dog who had survived what no one thought possible had just unmasked the man responsible. The department scheduled a ceremony, transforming the briefing room into a space of reverence. Officers, civilians, children, and veterans filled the seats, their eyes drawn to the scarred German shepherd standing proudly beside Daniel. Captain Maria Alvarez clipped a silver tag onto Shadow's collar, and her voice rang out, Some officers serve with words, some with actions, and some, though they cannot speak, serve with heart, instinct, and bravery. Today we honor a hero who returned from the shadows to bring justice once more. The room erupted into applause, a thunder of hands and voices rising in celebration, and Shadow, who had once tapped a paw against glass, begging to be seen, lifted his head and wagged his tail with pride for the first time. Daniel bent slightly, whispering into the dog's ear, "You didn't just need food, you needed someone. And now the world knows you again." That night under the winter stars, Daniel and Shadow returned to the cruiser, snow drifting gently across the quiet streets. As Daniel opened the door, Shadow hopped in with stiff but steady legs, curling into the seat with a sigh of contentment. Daniel started the engine, the red and blue lights reflecting off the snow, and asked, "You ready, partner?" Shadow barked once the sound steady and strong. Together they drove into the night, not as rescuer, and rescued not as officer and stray, but as family. And for everyone who had witnessed their journey, from the diners who laid down their money to the boy who smiled for the first time in months, Shadow became more than a survivor. He became a reminder that no soul is ever truly lost, that dignity can be restored, that love does not need to be loud to be heard. The end. If this story moved, you don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of Shadow's journey touched you most? And where in the world are you watching from? Share it in the comments. Your words mean more than you know.